That's a good question, and it's a question that the courts have been defining and struggling with ever since the 1960s when the Miranda case came out. Um, One clear case of custody is if you are placed under arrest and you are said, and the police officer says to you, okay, now I'm arresting you for robbery or for an assault, whatever. There's a lot of questioning that goes on when people are not under arrest. And so then the question becomes, are you in custody at that point, or are you not in custody? The cases suggest that in custody means whether you are free to leave. So some instances where you're not in custody, which might seem like you were in custody, is if a police officer calls you and says, hi, I'd like you to come, will you agree to come down to the police station and sit down and talk with me about that incident last night? If you go to the police station, even if you are escorted by officers up into some tiny little interview room and, it has no windows, and you sit down and, they ask you a lot of questions, and even if those questions are incriminating, like we were talking about before, or could lead to an incriminating response, you're not in custody at that point, because you agreed to come down to the police station, you came there voluntarily, and you can get up and leave whenever you want. If you don't like the way the conversation is going, you can walk out the door because you're not under arrest. And so that, those types of situations, police officer does not have to read you those Miranda warnings about your right to remain silent and your right to an attorney. Another tricky situation is traffic stops. So when you're driving a car and you get pulled over, maybe for speeding, or even if it's because the police officer thinks you might be drunk driving, the cases are pretty clear that normal routine traffic stops, you are not considered to be in police custody, which to me has always seemed kind of strange, because we all know that in a traffic stop, if the standard is, are you free to leave, I don't think there's a lot of people who would feel free to tell the police officer, I'm not really so into this, I think I'm just gonna go. But nevertheless, if it's a normal routine traffic stop, if the police officer didn't pull you, if he pulled you over for some traffic violation and not to pull you over specifically because he knew you were a suspect in that, robbery that happened last night, then that you're not considered to be in custody, and there's all kinds of questions that the police officer can ask you, and not just, your name and for your driver's license. The police officer can ask you questions like, how much did you have to drink tonight? And that's a question that could tend to make you say something not so great. You might tell the officer, oh, only 3 vodkas or something like that. And so you would think, well, probably I should be read my rights before the officer is going to ask me that question. But that's not the way our courts have found. Our courts have found that in traffic stops, they're allowed to ask questions because as part of their job in maintaining safety on the roads, they're allowed to ask those questions.
I have to agree with Sarah on that. The interesting piece of it is to say not every contact with police is custody. There are all kinds of people come in contact with the police officers every day. If every police contact where somebody didn't feel free to go because of politeness or because of other reasons was considered custody, the police would be really limited in what they could do on a day-to-day basis. So the courts have tried to draw a fairly rational rule as to what's considered custody. It's clear in the case law that if you are if you're in a place and at a time that an officer could reasonably believe is suspicious or dangerous, that they can momentarily detain you and pat you down for weapons, and questions that they ask you during that momentary detention are not considered Mirandizable questions. There is a wide range of interactions with the police that are not subject to Miranda warnings, even though they might involve questioning.